On it there. All right, and we're live. Welcome, everybody. This is Are We Ready to Be Future Ready? I'm going to go ahead and share my slides with everybody right now. So hopefully everybody can see that. And I see a lot of you are signing in there in the chat, telling us where you're from, what you guys do. A lot of you are doing lots of different things. Uh-oh, we have a New Orleans fan as well in the room. That's okay, too. I like New Orleans. And we also, for Teresa, who can mention it earlier, she and I both worked in a district where Drew Brees was actually the high school quarterback. A little knowledge there. So what I'll be doing again is going through this. Now, this presentation, I'll admit, is something that I've created maybe 3 or 4 years ago, not with anywhere near the scope of knowledge of what we have that's happened to us recently. So a lot of it, as we go through it, I've tweaked a lot of it to kind of represent what are we going through with our current situation with COVID. Um, and what does that look like in our future? And so a lot of you looks like are teachers. There's some professional development folks in the room. There's some college level folks in the room. So hopefully there's a little bit of everything. I'm not going to make this specifically about a subject area or anything like that. It's more of a broader topic to look at what are we doing in the future. And now that we know that this immediate future is going to be a little bit uneven, how do we prepare for that a little bit better too? So let's go ahead and drop into the presentation here. A little bit of my credentials. Those of you that don't know me, I'm an educator. I've been an educator for 21 years, a former classroom teacher for about 8 of those years, and then a administrator, yes, an evil administrator, if you will, for 13 of those years. I was the head of a one-to-one program that had 8,000 students of it here in Austin, Texas. I'm a former director of innovation. I've written books, and I'm also a Future Ready National Schools advisor and actually faculty member now on the tech side. So Future Ready is a great organization. I'll give you a little bit about them at the end. Free organization that does a lot to help support schools in the future. So I'll give you a little snippet of them at the end, but this is by no means a sales pitch. It's just more of who they are and what they're doing. And again, they're free, so I'm not selling you anything. So a little bit about me. Again, here's my girls. Someone who was I saw someone's a Saints fan there in the chat. Well, sorry, I'm an Eagles fan, as you can tell there. And so there's my 3 little girls. These are the years that they actually, graduate from high school, which is kind of crazy when you think about how much is going to change in their future. My oldest one there just went through 5th grade. Of course, the last bit of 5th grade without being a queen of the school because we shut down the schools. And I feel really bad, especially for all those seniors out there that missed out on that great opportunity of having that fun moment of the end of the senior year. So it's been an interesting year in a lot of ways. And yes, all as my middle child is pointing out, all 3 of them with the same last name, Hooker. So please pray for them, for those of you out there that do such things. So we'll see how they do. Sophia's going to middle school next year, and we'll see what that looks like for her in a lot of ways. It could be a lot different. I'll start a little bit with this quote. Now, there's actually some interesting news about Teddy Roosevelt right now in terms of the statue that's in front of the American, I think, National Science Museum in New York, but he's done a lot in terms of bringing a lot of culture and really preserving national parks. But I love this quote from him that says, "The more you know about the past, the better we're prepared for the future." And that's true in a lot of ways. And as a lot of us, you probably have been schooled in the last 3 months that there was a major pandemic in 1919, the Spanish flu, and how much of that is repetitive, and this talk isn't about that, but it does tell us that the past does inform our future in a lot of ways if we choose to listen to it, right? My past, this is probably one of my more embarrassing photos. I'll go ahead and start with that. This is me as a 10-year-old. I don't know what I'm doing there with those extremely short jorts, but yeah, I grew up all over the United States. This is actually with my grandmother there. She's holding just a random rooster for no reason there. We got a picture of us there, a pigeon coop in the background. And one thing I can tell you is that I've lived pretty much everywhere in this country, and there's a lot of things we have different, but there's also a lot of things we have in common. And I've gotten to learn that over the years, especially as a teacher, as you can see here. This is my first, it was probably my 3rd year as a teacher. I'm a 1st grade teacher. I'm right there, by the way, if you can't see me. Yeah, they're, these kids, it's kind of crazy. The one in the little striped dress there in the front, she actually just babysit my kids a couple days ago. She's 25 years old now, guys. That's college level kids. And this is 2001, 2002. This was when 9/11 happened. This was, I think about how different our world has been just in that amount of time with social media and mobile devices and everything else. And yet at the same time, I was trying to prepare these 1st graders, these 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds for a future that they weren't even sure of, And so I was trying to give them a wide variety of tools to help them and make them adaptable. And then it goes on. Here I am. Actually, this is me at Westlake High School just a couple of years ago talking to 700 freshmen about social media. And yeah, me and 700 freshmen in a huge giant hall, and then with maybe one or two teachers. But again, their future too is also uncertain. I mean, as ninth graders, they're going into, they don't know what the job market's going to look like in 4 years or in 8 years when they get out of college, let's say. So we need to be able to make sure that we're giving them those tools. And so as we look through these strategies now, we're going to really be hitting this on like kind of 4 areas. So the first area is going to be the idea of, let's look at the global future first. Let's see what's out there, what's happening, and then kind of what kind of disruptive technology. Now, disruption can be good or bad, and we'll talk about that. And there'll actually be a chat question for you guys on that too in just a little bit. But let's be thinking about what kind of disruptive technology is out there for the good, and also it could be bad. Also, let's talk about the use of space and time. We have completely rethought this in the last few months. A lot of you are probably, a lot of us have talked about scheduling and maybe some interesting things we can do to make it a little bit different. We have to completely rethink this now. And it's coming right next fall, I think, for a lot of you, depending on where you're joining me from. And then curriculum and instruction, of course, getting back into the classroom. So we start with kind of the wider 10,000-foot view of the global future, and then we scale down all the way into the actual classroom. And what can you do as a teacher? I see in the chat lots of different teachers from different subject areas, ELA, math. What are some things you can do? And again, I'm not going to give you specifics on your subject, but there are things you can do instructionally, things you can tweak that can help kind of adapt and allow for kids to have this this flexibility as they head into their future and kind of give them those skill sets. So let's start with the global future first. And as you look at these two videos here, I want you to call out, and go ahead and get in the chat there. I want you to call out, what are some things that you notice that are different about these two videos? And it's going to be tricky again on video streaming. It may be a little bit glitchy, but hopefully you can see the videos there. And then it only played for a few seconds. I'll replay those two for just a second. And again, what do you think are the biggest difference? Yeah. The modern one, Barb says there's no people in the modern one. That's true. Actually, there was a person, if you look for just a second, and it may not come through on video, but for just a half a second, there was somebody there on the video. There's actually a human in that screen somewhere, but what do you think that person was probably doing? Yeah, they were, man labor versus robotic labor. Thanks. Yeah, states that in the chat. Yeah, and somebody once said, well, one's black and white, one's color. Like, yeah, that's also a big difference. but right, there's still the idea of assembly line, but in one sense, you've got a lot of automation happening now, and the people that are actually creating this, yeah, James, that's right. The fast production of the machines. The people that are creating and running those things on the right, there are people involved in it. Now they're just behind the scenes. They're the ones turning on the machines. They're the ones fixing the machines when they break. Yeah, and I think Tyler adds in something too, which is great, that he talks about within human history, the automobile was a huge advance. Yeah, if you think about that, about how much that technology has evolved, wow. I mean, we've gone from the horse and buggy in the turn of the century with the Model T Ford in 1904, I mean, all the way to like self-driving cars now. So think about the rapid speed at which that's advanced compared to the pace of education, which is, of course, a little bit different. Look at these companies here. These are all companies that no longer exist. So if you look, and these are companies that when I was a kid, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, these were companies that were around. I mean, I'd go into a Borders books. I remember taking my kids to Blockbuster, not my kids, taking myself to Blockbuster just to get videos. Now I tell my kids today the story of Blockbuster and how, man, you never knew how easy you have it. I mean, you can just get stuff on demand. I had to go to the store, and sometimes they didn't have the video I wanted, It's kind of crazy. And then you look at Compaq there. That was a computer that I actually used to have in my classroom. This is what my classroom looked like in 5th grade. Barb misses Borders. Yeah, I do too. I miss that bookstore. Yeah, this classroom setup, I mean, this was like it, right? In 2000, this was, I want to say 2003, 2004, around that time, I was the techie teacher. I was the 5th grade teacher, and I had these like 3 machines in the back, and they played, Typing Monster and Reader Rabbit, things like that. And there are all these little CDs, and there was these little compact computers in the back of the room, and it was like, check the box, 15 minutes, you had your tech time. That's all you need to be ready. Yes, floppy disks. Yeah, this was actually a little bit past that, but yeah, some kids, if you show a kid a floppy disk now, James just mentioned it in the chat, it's funny to watch, because kids pretty much of the age of, I would say probably 8th grade, 9th grade. So probably about 14 or 15. If you show them a floppy disk, they aren't going to have any idea what it is. It's fun to watch them try to guess what it is too. And it's true. Barb does mention many classrooms still look like this. I mean, in a lot of ways, and we've seen that hugely in the last few months about the big gap in equity of access, and the fact that now some schools are finally starting to figure out, like, wow, we probably need to give them some sort of access to something. And maybe they can't afford it, or maybe they just need to figure out how to prioritize that to give them some sort of technology skills. Now, I'm not saying this is the right way either. Don't just plug the kids in and say, good luck, guys. There's a babysitter. I'll see you later. No, it's a lot different than that. We've got to make sure that we're engaging them in things. What they're doing in this screen here is very passive. They're sitting there with their headphones on, kind of passively just doing whatever it is. We want them creating, we want them doing actual designing on these machines too. So we need to think about that as well. Anybody remember this game? I mean, this is one of my favorites of all time. And I think about it, and by the way, the number one way to die in this game, if you ask a crowd of educators, and I don't know if someone can type it in the chat fast enough, but the number one way to die in this game is always the same. When I ask a crowd of educators, it's always this: you have died of dysentery. And I always tell people, remember back in the day when that was the only thing we had to worry about? Yeah. Of course, your carriage would get stuck in the river. You'd lose a wheel. All sorts of things would happen. If you stared up at the rain, you drowned. I mean, it was crazy. But it was a great way to engage kids because it had that kind of gaming element, but also there's some problem solving happening. And then, of course, one of my favorite games was this one. Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? This is one that actually, when I look at the software, when it was designed, the copyright is 1985, y'all. So I was 10 years old when this thing came out. There are educators right now, probably even in this chat, that were not invented before 1985. So again, another game, very somewhat passive, but again, you're problem solving, you're thinking about geometry, or not geometry, geography and history, and you're trying to mix it all together. So, I mean, and these were games that got you going in that direction. I felt like there was just the very tip of educational technology when you talk about the skills of what you can do with this. But again, very passive, very much like I'm going to play the game and try to get to the end of the level, and there's some value to gamification too. But I do think we need to think about, like, how are we actually having the kids create too? Now look at this. These are companies that didn't exist 40 years ago. So I'm a little past the age of 40. I'll go ahead and admit it. And I will tell you that when I was born, none of these companies ever existed on this planet. And so looking at this list compared to the list that we looked at earlier, it's kind of crazy. I mean, in some ways you still see, I still see airlines. There was airlines on the other list too, like Continental and TWA, which are no longer in business. Now we have JetBlue and Virgin Atlantic. And by the way, Southwest Airlines was about 43 years old, so it didn't quite make this list, but still fairly new. But you see a lot of service industry, a lot of tech, a lot of medical, things like that. Microsoft is on here, right? And that's who's putting this event on right now. I mean, they didn't even exist 40 years ago, which is kind of crazy. So that's where we're headed as a society in terms of these companies. And now I would say, even with this recent shift with the pandemic, we're probably seeing born a whole new group of companies, especially when it comes to biotech and the opportunities for that, or remote schooling, or remote teaching, or remote working. All of those things, all of these new things are starting to pop up, and it happens on a pivot point, just like we had recently with our disruption with the pandemic. And this isn't a talk to get you guys to invest in a timeshare or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but if you had two pennies to rub together, I mean, look at the scale of growth just in annual investments of these two. And here's how it ties into education, because you're probably thinking, well, this is great, Carl, but I'm a teacher. I'm not going to spend however many millions on stocks for this, and I'm not either. However, this does have impact in education. So the one on the right, robotics. I don't know how many of you in the chat have this, but the question is, do any of you have robotics in your schools? Like, do you have the ability to get robotics in your schools, or are you sending those home with kids? Anything like that? I think there's a lot of them out there now. There's low-cost robotics like Sphero or TrashBots or things like that, where kids are actually able to use robots to kind of build things themselves. So that's growing in schools. STEM, STEAM, those are big things. Now the one on the left, a little bit different. Artificial intelligence in schools is a very touchy subject right now because of privacy and safety concerns. But I would wager that many of you in the chat, but also anyone watching this, might have some sort of digital assistant or artificial intelligence in your home. I mean, I've got an Alexa in my house. And so, yeah, it's interesting how it starts consumer based and then it starts to kind of move into educationally based. And I think there is a place for AI in schools. And I think what it'll do is it'll help kind of take care of some of the low hanging fruit in terms of like those lower level Bloom skills. Once we get over all the privacy stuff about things listening in and recording all of us, of course, we got to get through that first. But I think there is some application there, and what that can allow us as teachers to do. Those of you that are teachers in the chat, all of a sudden you'll be able to like say, okay, I can kind of put some of this stuff to rest. They can, as long as they know how to access the information. Now I can start giving them harder challenges, things that they can use to apply that information to actually grow and move going forward. That kind of teach them that adaptability. Just going to take a quick peek in the chat, and it's interesting. There's a couple good things that have come up. There's a few of you that are using robotics teams. That's awesome. James asked a really good question when I showed those companies that were, let me back up to that. When I showed this, companies that didn't exist 40 years ago, he asked the question, and I love this. Which of these companies won't exist in the next 40 years? Which of these, when you look at them, you think, wow, that may not be a thing. You know, maybe the big box stores of Target are gone, or maybe they're all moved online, or Home Depot. I mean, is it possible that you could just not have to go in and get the wood? You just hit a button and it delivers to your door. I mean, they're all adjusting on the fly right now in terms of that method, in terms of people coming into their homes. Costco, Starbucks, of course, the tech companies come and go. I mean, there's a few on here that probably existed 10 years ago that no longer exist today, right? I don't see MySpace on here anywhere for those of you that remember that. So that's a great question, James. Yeah, and I think that is going to change. I think that's going to continue to grow. Yeah, Instacart has been taken off lately, and I imagine it would, Barb, because think about everyone. So there's going to be this growing need of where we're headed as a society too, and it adapts like that. And some of these grow fast and wide. Some of them grow fast and then just totally bomb out right afterwards. So it's going to be hard to kind of predict that, but that's a great point in the chat there. We mentioned a little bit about automation. Again, this is just the global future. Now, the World Economic Forum met in January. This is right before the pandemic really took off. And they met as a group in Davos. And one of the things they kind of estimated was this idea of the division of labor in terms of the shared hours spent between human and machine. So this again is predicted. So right now, the current state, 2018, they went back and looked at that. They show that 29% of regular, what we call day labor or just regular labor work, is being done by machines. And their prediction is pretty rapid if you think about it. I mean, in 2 years, it's going to be shifted to, almost nearly 50%. And then by 2025, it's almost half, more than half now is automated. And so again, predictions, you never know where this is going to go. You never know what's going to be thrown at it. Obviously, in terms of what we're dealing with now, it could be something completely different. But it is interesting to think about that. So I look at this in two different ways, and I kind of think it could be good or bad, right? There could be that some of those low-level automated tasks are getting done by machines, and that could be taking away work, which is a bad thing. Or the flip side of that is, of course, there's opportunity then when all of a sudden these low-level automated tasks are taking over those jobs. Maybe there's other jobs that are born out of that opportunity. And so I like to think of it kind of that way. But definitely, this is a shift that's been coming for years and decades, I would argue. So it's one we have to think about. Just recently, I was up in Seattle. This was back in last fall, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to one of these. If you have any of these in your area, but there's a few of these Amazon Go stores, and it's kind of crazy. You walk in and you think about how everything's changed. Oops, let me go back there. So you have this guy, and you kind of walk in and you scan your phone, and essentially what you're doing is scan your phone, and then you're able to walk in. There's nobody there. There's nobody actually in the actual department store, in the store itself. It's just a little kind of kind of like a 7-Eleven, I guess, a little convenience store. You walk in, grab your stuff, and just walk out, right? And see what's going to happen then. It's kind of crazy to see how that's changed everything. Like my life. This is my life right now, by the way. Alexa, homeschool the children, please. Yes. So I mean, that AI is coming, and what is it doing, and how is it automating things? And then, as Barb mentions, the shift could impact curriculum completely. I agree. So I'm going to drop out of the presentation for just a second and go into the chat. So I'm going to leave this question up here. Actually, and I'm going to just kind of watch down below. So this is actually a quote from Professor Varshi out of Rice University right here in Houston, in the Texas area. And he predicted, this is about 2 years ago, he made this quote, and it was that he thinks that 50% of jobs are going to be automated in the next 30 years. So he predicted that. So my secondary question off of that prediction is, if that is true, if we see that trend continuing, we just saw a trend where it looks like it's going to be even faster than that, what skills should we be teaching our students? So what I want you to do is drop into the chat and just drop in there and talk about what are some skills we need to be teaching our kids. Again, in coding, that's important, things like that. But I'm also thinking, like, what are some bigger skills in terms of like things that maybe the robots can't do, right? What are those skills? What are those traits that can't be automated necessarily? And I'm looking down in the chat right now, and I see some great answers already popping up. Yep, communication skills, teamwork. Oh, yes. Soft skills. I've heard it called that I use that term all the time. However, one time someone told me, you don't call them that, call them future ready skills or 21st century skills. And I was like, yeah, soft doesn't mean that they're, unimportant. I think that's important for people to know, but some people see that and think the wrong thing. But I like that term myself. Yeah, communication. And that comes in multiple forms. Teresa points out, it's not just communication in terms of talking. It's also in the reading. It's also in writing. It's also in collaborating, right? Those interpersonal skills that MN mentions. They need to add, work collaboratively as teams to solve a given problem. That is one of the biggest challenges I've seen during this pandemic, is when a lot of kids were suddenly shuttered to their homes. All of a sudden the collaboration really fell off, and it's just hard to do. Some people use little breakout rooms and things like that where they can actually have the kids working in small groups, but it becomes more challenging. The crazy thing is, and a lot of you that know this or know people that work in the tech industry know that there's been online collaboration happening for years. I have a friend who works for for Dell, and she's a project manager for teams over in Asia, and so she's working with them all the time. She's up late at night collaborating. So there is some possibility there. I think as teachers, we'll have to think about how do we do that collaborative part in the future. How to navigate technology is another good one. Yeah. Problem-based learning. Yeah. The UN global goals. Those are awesome. Yeah. If you haven't had a chance to check those out, there's a lot of great ones in there. We used to, I chatted with a friend in South America, and what he does with his kids is he has each one of them pick one of the UN global goals to tackle, and essentially they create a team of challenges, like to say, okay, how do we help starvation? How do we help with this, poverty? What are some of the bigger issues with pollution, and how do we overcome those? So, and sometimes kids come up with some crazy ideas, and they're outside of the box ideas. So why don't we take advantage of that? Empathy. Thank you. Yes, that's true. A robot can't really feel, right, in a lot of ways. And it's crazy. It's crazy how we think about empathy as one of those skills that's like, well, that's just kind of, we need to have, but especially now, I would say, when we don't see each other face to face, especially now, I mean, or on social media, even in the last few years, if you've been on like Facebook or Twitter or anything, it gets pretty crazy, the lack of empathy that I see on there. And what are we modeling for our own kids when we go on rants ourselves, right? And I've gotten to where I've started taking a real pensive look at everything on social media, and I'm pretty careful about it, but I'm also like, there's a lot of opportunities there for social justice, but there's also a lot of opportunities for people to troll and be negative, and just not a lot of empathy happening there. Yeah, and Barb mentions one more that I'll mention in the chat, and it's accepting failure. And I think that's a big one. I think that's hard in schools because the failure is the F word in schools. We got to watch out for, right? By the way, this is an interesting website. If you ever get a chance to look at it, as we're talking about automation, willrobotstakemyjob.com. This is an actual website. I'll go ahead and type in teachers here and see what the percentage likelihood is. So teacher, the chance that a robot will take your job is 0.95%. In the next 20 years, it looks like you are totally safe. Whew, that's good, especially for a lot of the teachers in the chat. You're like, why am I getting into this? Now, I will say there are some schools that have tried to do, there was a school in Japan that tried to do like a robot teacher, and I think it lasted all of a couple of days before the kids like tied the robot up and kind of took over the classroom. But there is some automated things that we can do in our jobs that could help us too. I mean, I think about grading, I think about attendance, I think about things that are the low-hanging fruit. And a grading isn't necessarily a low-hanging fruit, but it is something that can be somewhat automated now. If the more we can do that as a teacher, the more we can kind of clear our plate for more creative endeavors with our students, which is interesting too. Yeah, Tyler goes, I'd like to see a robot do what I do. Yeah, that would be interesting to see how that looks. I guess they don't have to worry about social distancing if it's a robot, but still, that's going to be tricky. So again, back to the WEF, when they talked, the World Economic Forum met, the other thing they've done is they've kind of listed this out. This was a couple of years ago. This is 2018 when I got this data, and they've kind of revised it in this last year. But essentially, you're looking at the top job skills. Now, again, teaching kids isn't just about getting them job ready, because I think there's more to life than just getting a good job. I think that's important, but I think life happiness is still the most important thing. But part of that is, making sure they can get a job and support themselves. So, you look at these skills over here, problem solving. By the way, the shift, if you look from 2015 to 2020, is not much different. I mean, problem solving is still number one. So math teachers in the chat, you guys are like, yes, I tell you, that's why it's important. Science, the same thing. This is important stuff, right? Coordinating with others and people management, still important. That's that skills of being able to work with others, right? If you have a disagreement with somebody and you're having to work with them on a project, how do you overcome that? Critical thinking and creativity. So our art people out there, our ELA, I mean, all that stuff. Think about the creativity, and those are things that robots can't do, right? So how do we continue to evolve that? The crazy thing is creativity, I feel like, unfortunately, is like the first thing to go a lot of times in schools when things are getting cut. It's like, well, we got to get rid of the arts programs. We got to get rid of the music, right? Even though in a lot of ways that helps the kids, So then as teachers, our job is like, how do we embed creativity into our everyday lessons? I don't care if you're math or science or whatever, you need to figure out a way to how to embed that. And I think a lot of you probably already have kind of unique ways to do that. Some of these other ones have shifted around a little bit, like decision-making, negotiation, service orientation, which is important, But then someone mentioned empathy in the chat, and I think that's perfect. I mean, look, emotional intelligence, boom, it got added to the list this last year. And then cognitive flexibility, another one. Someone mentioned failure in the chat. That's another one. How do you overcome something when you fail, right? And a lot of our kids struggle with that. They say like, oh, I've messed up on this one thing and I'm just going to give up. Or they look to the teacher and say like, what do I need to do next? And I'll admit, as a parent and as a teacher, I messed up a lot with that, where I would just kind of nudge the kid on the way instead of letting them actually struggle a little bit and figure out, how do I overcome the struggle? That's really where that learning takes place, is kind of overcoming that struggle. If it gets to the point of severe frustration, obviously you've lost any ability to learn at that point. But a little bit of creative struggle is a really good thing, I think, for kids, especially for learning. So that cognitive flexibility comes into play. So let's move to this next section now. We're going to talk a little bit about disruptive technologies. Just taking an eye on the time here. You guys are doing a good job in the chat there. Awesome. Yeah, disruptive technologies. There's a lot of them. I actually had lots of videos for this too, but they don't come over well over in on video stream. So I'm going to actually cut to some different ideas here. But I'm going to start with just the disruption in one field in particular. Somebody mentioned in the chat that travel and transportation has definitely evolved rapidly over the last 100 years. I would argue that also communication, if you think about the level of communication and the involvement of what's happened in the last 50 years, even how much it's changed. And I always like to share a story real quick. This is actually my aunt Gloria there. This is my birthday a couple of years ago. We're out here getting barbecue down in Texas. And that she worked for what was called Ma Bell Telephone. I don't know if you guys remember Bell Telephone. It's been bought out now by AT&T and stuff. But back in 1948, she started out with Ma Bell Telephone. She worked there for 50 years, y'all. That was so when she started, she was actually working with phones that looked a lot like this, plugging in wires and things like that, and running in switchboards. When she retired in 1998, she was actually climbing up cell phone towers as a 72-year-old woman and installing the technology that's put in place. She always had a growth mindset. So she was always willing to learn. But think about that, just in her 50 years in that company, how much it changed. And the telephones changed a lot too. Remember back in the 50s and 60s, we were able to get to this, where all of a sudden you can actually dial numbers. Of course, some of us still have these, which are great. I think they're actually worth something now. They're antiques. But they were eventually replaced too by, push button technology as well. And then, of course, the problem with these technologies, again, communication was possible, but you had to actually go and be tethered on a cord. So for those of you that were old enough to remember this, as teenagers, if you ever wanted to have a private conversation with one of these things, you had to have a really long cord and then slam a door and hide underneath it to make sure the cord would go through the door so you could have your private conversation in another room. And then this came out not too long, well, early 80s, I would say, cordless technology, late 70s. So again, all of a sudden you're not tethered with your communication. You can walk around the house to a limit. I mean, after a little distance, you start to get some kind of disruption on your phone line. But for the most part, you can still walk around the house with these. Of course, that still limited you because you're still limited in your communication to just your house. That, of course, evolved into this, which is a beautiful giant piece of technology. I actually saw the other day they have a retro version of this where you can actually put your phone as like a phone holder, put your actual phone in there, which would be hilarious. Yeah, this thing, the brick phone, otherwise known as, of course, the Zach Morris phone too. I mean, and this thing was great. You could actually leave the house and go have conversations. Now, the problem with it was about $6 a minute. So if you wanted to have a conversation, for 5 minutes, it was costing you $30 just to talk. So not really in most people's price points. Only a certain few people could have them, like Zach Morris there. Yeah, and then James says, yeah, it worked for about 30 minutes and then died. The battery on this thing was awful. But we complain about our battery life now, but think about it. This phone here, actually, believe it or not, is the first cell phone I ever owned. I still actually have it. It looks a little bit like a walkie-talkie, this Nokia phone. And what was crazy about this is now it's wireless. So now we're able to leave the house and be able to have longer conversations, not for $6 a minute. But it could do something that the other phones couldn't do. And if you remember, this is also one of the first phones. You could see it with the letters there. This is one of the first phones you could text with. MM says, yeah, I had that Nokia phone. Yeah. So if you remember, this is the first one you could text. Now, communication had changed from verbal to now text-based communication that you could do on these phones. Of course, to type the word hello, you had to type 44335555556666. That equaled hello because you had to get to actually every one of the keys. So again, kids today, they have it so easy, right? But yeah, this is one of those phones that, again, now there was the flip phone. Someone's mentioning, Barb, and that was what I was going to get to the next one. So in 2004, I want to say, there was a phone that came out. And this was it. I mean, this was like the ultimate phone. I told my wife, I was like, honey, I know it's $400, but it's beautiful. It has this great sounding name. It was slick. It was metallic. I don't know if you guys remember the Razor, but this thing was just incredible. And the crazy thing about this phone, it was like a weapon, right? You could walk around with it, and it had something else that you could do that the other phones couldn't do. So now before this, we just added the ability to text, but now the Razor gave you the ability to actually do what? Actually take photos, which is kind of crazy. Speaking of phones, there's mine ringing in the background. That's awesome. And then, of course, things change. Companies come out with their own phones. Like, here's my daughter here. And she, of course, invented in 2008. And then you think about the modern everyday smartphone invented in 2007. It brings to question a lot of different quotes. So one of the ones I want to talk about is this one here. And this is Douglas Adams. So Forgive me if you guys know this quote, but he has a lot of things where he talks about disruption and the future of technology. So I always kind of go to him in some of his work when I look at things like this. So technology is, in his mind, and this may speak to some of you also in the chat, and if it does, that's awesome. It's kind of interesting how he breaks technology down into three components. Component one is anything that's in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary, and it's just natural and part of the way the world works. So if I think about my daughter there, she was invented in 2008. Like I said, there's a lot more to the invention than just, never mind, I won't get into the details, but you get the idea. But she was born in 2008. In fact, I would say any kid right now that is in elementary school or even early middle school probably doesn't know or remember a world where a smartphone didn't exist. So that's just normal, right? That's part of their everyday life. I would argue also that any kid that's about 4 or 5 years old, they won't know a world where like a smartwatch or an Alexa or some sort of digital assistant doesn't exist. Think about that. For us, those are huge. Like the other day, I told Alexa to like vacuum the house, and she kind of did, although the vacuum cleaner didn't work. But at the same time, like to me, I was super excited. My kids see that and they're like, yeah, that's just normal. That's the way it should work, Dad. And it's kind of crazy. So then I go to this next part. And this is technology is anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary, right? And you can get a job in it probably. So this is those kids getting really excited about making apps for the App Store, designing games, esports, all of this stuff, right? STEM, STEAM. And there's all these opportunities out there, and that's the opportunities for those jobs. And that's true. That is kind of that sweet spot of when people are rushing to market and rushing to get into these fields. But unfortunately for me, I don't fall into either of these categories anymore. For those of you that have been listening from the beginning, you know I'm older than 35. I'm in this last category, and that is that anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. It is evil, and it should go away. Not necessarily. And I'm a pretty high-tech person and a high-tech dad. I've got, like I mentioned, I have 3 little girls. And I feel like I've got it kind of figured out, but I don't understand why they like to sit and watch other people on YouTube play Minecraft versus playing it themselves. That part doesn't get me. They like to watch other people play games, and I'm not sure why that is. They also, there's also this dance. Remember, Fortnite came out, and all of a sudden you could do all these different dances based on a video game. I mean, there's some things I still don't figure out. So, yeah. Anyway, and we remember, of course, back in our day, there was also this bit of disruption, right? You remember that white van that would drive around your neighborhood? You had to watch out for it. Don't get in the car. The child kidnappers would come in to get you. So don't get in a car with strangers. I was always told that as a kid growing up. I tell my kids this today. And then, of course, it's like I tell my kids now, it's like, be careful when you're on the internet, even though you're playing those games like Animal Jams and Roblox. Those games have chat features that you can meet people on. You don't meet strangers from the internet. And then, of course, they're watching me. And then what do? I do the exact thing I tell them not to do. So today, what do? I contact a stranger from the internet, and then I ride in their strange car. I mean, we've come full circle in a lot of ways. So sometimes you have to be careful when you lay down those severe rules, like to think, how do we need to adjust even our words and what we're saying to our kids and our students, right? How does that affect them in the future? Because yes, times have definitely changed. This was my actually first computer system I ever owned when I was a 5-year-old. I was one of 3 people on the entire block that had a computer. And it's crazy to think about the digital divide then versus now. There is still a digital divide. And I think it's that access that somebody talked about earlier in the chat about how some classrooms still only have limited use of technology. And those students aren't getting the same opportunities as students maybe on the other side of town. I mean, it's just, you can be from one district to another, and it's different how districts value the use of technology. So my next question for the chat is this. I've been talking for a little bit there. Let's go back into the chat. And I like that a lot of you are still dropping stuff in there. Yeah. Barbara has the Princess phone. Yep. There was also the pink razor. Oh, yes. That was my wife's actual phone too, the pink razor. So my question for you is this. Now, what kind of technology do you think will be disruptive for schools in the future? Now, disruptive, again, I'm going to qualify this by saying disruption can be both good and bad. So whatever you put in the chat, it could be something that we could say that could be a good thing, but also know that it could be a bad thing. So disruption isn't always necessarily bad. I think some people see that and think, oh, it's disruptive because they're making a mess. No, disruption can be good. So go into the chat and just drop in a few things. Some things I may have mentioned already, or some things you're thinking about, like, I think in the future this will be something that's disruptive for education. So I'll actually pull out of my screen share so you guys can see me. Oh, now I can see some of your faces. There's Barb. Hey, Barb. All right. Teachers need to create tools for digital content. Yeah, I think that's important. Every child will have a smartphone with them on campus. I do think, and Tyler hits a good point. There is trends now that the digital divide is shrinking in terms of who has access to smartphones. There is still a little bit of a gap there, but I want to say the last data I read, which was about a year ago, was about I want to say about 88% of low economic families had access to some sort of cell phone, smartphone, versus like 96% of high economic. So there's still not even 100% of all levels, but there is definitely more opportunity there. What are some other things here? I see a lot of people, see some people typing some stuff in. And Adriana just joined us there too. Adriana, just asking the question, what are some sort of, what kind of technology do you think will be disruptive for schools in the future? I haven't seen anyone put the ones I'm thinking about here, but I already know that there's a couple. Like whenever I go to robots, for sure. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Monica. Whenever I go to trade shows, I see a couple different technologies recently, especially, that seem to be like everybody's on board with these things. And it is, will we have a DNA printout? Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, it'll be like the Matrix barb at some point. We'll be able to just plug in and say, like, okay, based on you. Now, that would be interesting to say, like, because your brain works this way. We're going to get to it in just a second. We talk about schedules. That would be awesome data to have. Of course, there's also the privacy concerns that everybody worries about with that. Grammar and writing checks. Yeah. Microchips. I'm thinking AR and VR are two that I've seen a lot that people. I don't know that it's kind of trying to make its way into education. We've been using virtual reality with our own students. They're my kids, but they're also my students, right? Because I'm homeschooling, just to take them to different places. So we went and visited a reef the other day. I had them put on the goggles and do that. We used Nearpod, has the little the Nearpod virtual reality stuff where you can actually go and travel to different places, which is pretty neat. Yeah, that's what Monica said. Yeah, Nearpod's VR is pretty sweet, and it's built in. I think it's 360 Cities is who gives them all that stuff for free. But I mean, just that ability to do that right now, especially when we can't travel anywhere, is kind of a neat way to get them to kind of go to different places. Let me go back into the session here. So yeah, continue to use that chat there. I'll ask you guys another question. I want to make sure we get through everything, and we're doing okay on time as of right now. So let me go to this next part here. And I will say that, the Clayton Christensen, who actually passed away at the beginning of the year, I want to say that, his main wheelhouse was not necessarily education, but he had a lot of impact on education. His main thing was obviously about businesses and marketing growth. But I do think I like this quote in particular because I personally know that there are schools, and I've worked with schools across the country as a consultant, but also as an administrator, where technology can be seen as a challenge, right? Kids, it's disruptive for kids, it's disruptive for parents, it's disruptive for the teacher. So, as an administrator, sometimes you can say, well, the easy way out of that one is just to say, we're not going to allow it, or we're going to lock it down so much that no one can use it. And I think that there is some value to having some restrictions put in place, but at the same time, we have to think about how do we use this to our advantage, And I'm not saying like we need to go out and say like everybody needs to play Fortnite for EDU or something like that. But can we reach those certain kids? And I think somebody mentioned, and it was Barb who said something about how their brains work. I mean, there's certain kids that think different ways. And is there something that we can use technology for to help those kids? Maybe not every kid. I know personally that out of my 3 kids, one of them has a problem when she's on the screen for too long. So for her, I kind of keep eyes and restrictions on her. But the other 2, they're fine reading on a digital screen, and one of them prefers to read on a paper book. And I think it comes down to the brain science behind it. And it's hard when you try to make a one size fits all in anything, admittedly. So we have to be careful with some of that. Yeah, and then Barb says, how do we use it as admin to tell our story? That's right. You almost have to get ahead of the negative. There's a lot of power behind the negative behind technology, but there's not a lot of people that really organize around the positives around it too. So I think as an administrator, you have to kind of slowly drip out the things that are happening positively when it comes to technology usage. And I don't think it's about gaming. I think it's more about that creative stuff that we talked about at the very beginning. So students definitely knowing more about their teacher, the technology and their teachers, that's a concern. And I say that as a good and a bad. I mean, I'm doing a session later this week called 21 Things That a 21st Century Educator Should Do. And one of the things in there, I'll go ahead and give it away, is I talk about CoSpaces EDU, which is a great virtual reality tool where you can design virtual reality essentially on a computer screen. It's all tech. You can do the coding of it. Everything's drag and drop coding. I got in there and spent 30, 40 minutes trying to figure out how to make a bird fly across the screen. And I was like, this is terrible. No teacher's going to ever use this because it's so hard to use. So then what I did is I went and gave it to a bunch of 10-year-olds. And of course, they figured it out in like 5 minutes. And I was like, wait a minute, maybe I'm being held up too much on the tech part of it. Maybe I need to tell them, like, here are the objectives, here are the goals I want you to achieve with this tool. You figure out how to do it, and I want you to actually demonstrate that you understand it. And I think when we start getting in our own way, that's when it becomes a problem, right? When we start blocking some things because we're not comfortable, because we don't know as much as a kid, or let those kids be those teachers, right? This is kind of an idea of a, I don't know. This is one of these mock-ups, and again, I don't know if it's coming through well on the chat, but this is what one of these schools of the future that I've seen. This is, I think, so this case they have like two kids playing a game on a screen, but actually they're in different parts of the world, and oh, I love that as a tech director, unbreakable glass, please, let's have that. Teacher. Now, what's interesting is you watch this futuristic video, and it just kind of dawned on me, and I don't know if you guys noticed this too, but like this is supposed to be the future, and they have screens, and it's neat, and everyone's smiling. By the way, the future, everyone's very happy apparently in the future. But I noticed something interesting about the teaching and learning taking place, and that is that it's still very structured in terms of teacher up at the front, student raises their hand dutifully, right? And maybe that's just a snippet of this classroom because they wanted to model what a classroom would look like. But I would argue and push back that the classroom looks different than this. You can have the technology in it, but maybe those interactions are more collaborative. Some of the things you guys mentioned early in the chat about skills we need to be giving our kids is collaboration. So if they're all sitting in their desk, raising their hands and talking back and forth to the teacher, there's not a lot of collaborating taking place. Yeah, still sage on the stage, as Teresa mentions. And I've heard the other side of that, of course, is, you want to be the guide on the side. I would push it to the next level. Dean Sharesky once shared this, and he likes to be the mentor in the center or the meddler in the middle. I like that idea, whereas like you're almost like the project manager and you're sending kids off to do their projects and they're coming to you versus you just kind of watching them. Kind of the guide on the side almost sounds like you're being passive, like, okay, go do this thing and I'll just kind of watch what you're doing. So I kind of like those different phrases too, which gets us to these next two parts. And I want to make sure we get through these. We got we're doing pretty good, about 16 minutes. I'll make sure we have time. Maybe they're getting in breakout sessions on their screens while in the classroom. Yeah, that's a great one. I saw that too. There was I did a session recently. I did a professional development, which is really interesting, by the way. If you've ever done a full day PD, completely virtual, with a school in Virginia, we did a full day, and I said, I'm not going to put teachers on a screen for the whole day because you wouldn't want to do that to kids either. So I had them break up into different groups and do different projects, just like I would want kids to do. And we did breakout rooms to have discussions, and then I had them come back and share what they were doing. So they had takeaways and they had tasks, but there was a couple hours where I didn't see them. I said, I'll check. You can check in with me if you have questions, and I'll be available, like what I would call office hours. But for the most part, I had teachers going off and doing what I would want them to model with their kids, because you don't want your kids to say, okay, stay on the screen while you listen to me talk. So even like the conversation we're having now, even though you're looking at your screen, at least we're having some interaction and dialogue. And I think that's important to know too. So space and time. This has changed a lot over the last several months. And I would say, one of the things I've learned, by the way, a great form of professional development for teachers out there and also for administrators, if you're out there in the chat, if you can do this at some point in your future, try to be a student for the day. And it would be interesting to do now too, especially when you have to be a student virtually, to see like how hard is the work? Are you getting through it? A lot of you that are parents as well probably are experiencing what it's like to be a student at the moment because you're helping your kids with their schoolwork. But I love this. I love this challenge. I did this. This is me going into Westlake High School here in Austin, dressed up as a student, and I decided to follow a student schedule for the entire day and see what was the schedule like. This was the schedule of the student I followed. This was a sophomore, 10th grader here in Austin, and you can see the schedule there. It's a little bit blurry, but you get an idea. Basically, we're talking 15-minute class periods, 6-minute transitions, lightning fast. And I'll admit, I was late for a couple classes. I was running around. This building's massive. I'll go and admit also that chemistry, they had a quiz that day when I walked in. Again, I'm a 43-year-old man walking into this class, and the teacher looks at me and I was like, yeah, I want to take the quiz too. I'm a student today. She gave me the quiz and I failed it. I'll admit it. It was the same thing I failed when I was a 16-year-old in chemistry too. It turns out it was Bohr's law, which I just need to ask Alexa what it is. But it was interesting to see how tight the schedule ran and how intense it was. And by the end of the day, I was completely exhausted. And I'm not talking about the tech or non-tech. I mean, and I will tell you this too. There's a big general misunderstanding, miscommunication, and assumption that teachers that are quote unquote younger teachers seem to have technology down. And I will say that is not necessarily, that's a broad generalization. That's not always true. I do think that there are teachers that of all ages that can figure out ways to use technology in a smart way. And a lot of it comes down to the basic tenets and skills of good teaching and learning. It doesn't have to do about the tech. I do think that younger teachers maybe pick up the tech quicker, but that doesn't mean they have the skills in which to use it well. And I think that's important too. This was me sitting in this classroom, and I will just tell you, again, what it's going to look like in the fall, I don't know. It's going to be spread out. These desks I would call torture devices. In fact, I wrote a blog right after I sat in this thing. I was like, this thing has got to go away. It's evil. If you've ever sat in one of those all-in-one things, just thinking about how traditional those are too. Like we need to sit in these desks because that's just the way they've always been. We need to sit in these rows, and those were kind of designed. The rows were designed, on the factory model. Also, they were designed for cleanliness, so that way the custodians can get in between the desks quickly and easily. So they're put in rows, so you could just sweep in between. So again, nothing to do with learning with these. That's just the way they were, and it was easy. And by the way, they last forever. I mean, they would survive just about anything short of a nuclear attack because they're just indestructible. So I think that's why a lot of schools use them. But I do think there's some opportunities out there for more flexible seating, standing. I hope some of you are doing this throughout the day, even during this chat. If you're standing up at some point, stretching out, I think that's important. I think it is important to have the brain, get that re-engaged. So what I'm going to ask you to do right now is, even though if you're sitting there listening right now, if you are sitting, I'm going to ask you just to stand we're going to do this for about 30 seconds. We're going to take a little mini brain break. Just stand up. I'm going to do it too. So I'm standing away from the microphone a little bit, and just kind of stretch out a little bit. Stretch out your arms, stretch out a little bit, stretch out your shoulders, kind of roll your neck a little bit there, get your chin to touch down. Just a little mini yoga here, because I think it's important that as you're doing this, and breathe, make sure you breathe deeply. I think this is important too for kids. I think we go so fast that we don't take a moment to take a breath, and even a little bit of mini meditation. I think even on a Zoom call, or on a Teams call, or on a whatever call, Google Meet, you should still be able to have that moment of pause where you can have the kids just take a break. I know you want to get through a lot of information with them, but it's important to take that breath and take that brain break and just think for a minute, let them stop and think about what they're doing, practice in the moment mindfulness. I will say that this has great impact on our kids. And I have a personal story real quick that I'll share. As my daughter's second grade teacher, she started experimenting with 1 minute of what she would call a kind of a mindfulness exercise meditation. So what she did is she noticed that in the afternoons, when the kids got back from their from lunch and everything, that they were just rowdy. They were having a hard time kind of getting focused on the rest of their day. And she always struggled with productivity in the end of the day. And it turned out she had a lot of math in the end of the day. And the kids just couldn't focus on it. And so she started doing this little activity, and it's hard, admittedly. I see Teresa said she tried it with 8th graders. They were not going to opt in. It's hard. And in kids, it's hard to get them to sit. It's hard for adults, by the way, too, to sit and not do anything for a minute. So she put a clock up and said, okay, we'll do 1 minute and just sit and think. And she did this for, I want to say, a month. And it was hard, she said, but eventually she stretched them to 2 minutes, and then she kind of stopped there. These are 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds. She was like, she was starting to struggle, but she said 2 minutes. But what she noticed was, on the back end of that, is that the rest of their afternoon tended to go a lot more productively. They tended to have a lot better afternoons. Their work quality of work was better. Their focus was better. Their behavior was better. And a lot of times, I know as teachers, you guys are probably worried about cramming through as much content as you can. And I think you have to, for certain reasons, right? You have to meet certain standards and things like that. But to take a pause for 1 minute or 2 minutes, how powerful is that to have in your classroom too? It's also, I will tell you real quick before I go to the next part, there is some brain science behind this. If you are basically whatever you teach, whatever grade, right now the science shows that I want to say it's however old your students are, that's about how many minutes they can go before they need some sort of break, or transition, I would say. So adults, by the way, it's about 20 minutes. So I'm glad that a lot of you are engaging. And the break for us has been this little break, but also we've had some chat moments. So I try to plan those into my talks too, to about every 20 minutes have some sort of interactive break or transition. But for kids, I mean, if you're teaching 5-year-olds, guys, and those of you that are out there that are kindergarten at 1st grade, you've got 5 or 6 minutes, and then you've got to have something else. And maybe it's a transition to a video, or maybe it's a song, or maybe they're going to turn and talk to each other, or maybe it's just stop, or stand up and stretch. So you got to have those kind of built in too. And it's hard to do virtually, admittedly, but I've seen some teachers starting to do that more with like playing the little games like scavenger hunts where they run away and go find little items. And I will say that also outdoors, we're going to start to experience a lot more of outdoor learning, I would say, as a result of everything that's happening with the virus. This is not just necessarily the best way to do it, just putting desks and rows outside. But you think about flexible learning spaces, and I know a lot of you are from all over the country and actually all over the world, it looks like from the chat. So you may not have the ability to do this, but I think outside learning is one of the best flexible learning environments out there, and it costs nothing. You could just take your kids outside. Now here in Texas, we got to watch out because pretty much in August when we get started up again, it's going to be almost too hot to be outside, except for early mornings. But there is the fresh air, the vitamin D, all of that actually helps get the oxygen to the brain. Here I am. This is me as a substitute teacher. I like to substitute teach for my daughter's classes. And as an administrator, those of you that are administrators in the room or doing PD, I think this is also another thing to do that's important, is to actually go in and try the technology that you're putting into schools, because a lot of times school districts are putting technology in place and they aren't actually going in and seeing what the experience is like. So I did activities every year with my daughter's teachers, and this was me just doing a first grade activity. And this is somebody mentioned in the chat Nearpod VR. This is us doing VR. Now I want to tell you something as you're watching this. I actually never told the kids to stand up. And there's a kid over in the corner that was just spinning in circles, I noticed. This is them. They were looking at, I think it's Machu Picchu, and they're looking around Machu Picchu, and they're experiencing this kind of in real time. And then what's interesting is I just pushed a question out to them. And notice what happens. A lot of them go straight to sit down again. It's like the second we go to the question part, they all sit down. Again, I've never told them to stand or sit. They just kind of naturally do it. And just that little bit of transition helps them, helps their brain, helps them stretch just a little bit. So having to be able to do that is tricky. Yeah. Yes, thanks, Teresa. Try remote teaching 30 kids. Yes. Nearpod, by the way, is something you could do remotely. And I'm going to be doing an activity, I think, later on the summer with on this Global Ed Tech Academy, where we'll be doing some stuff with Nearpod too, because they integrate with Microsoft well. So lots of good stuff you can do there. But yeah, it's tricky. Yeah, teaching 30 kids. Teresa, I'm sure that once you leave them for a minute, they may not come back to the screen. But kids get engaged. I mean, look at this kid here. He's like, wow, what in the world's going on here? And for some of these kids, they haven't seen some of these things before in their life. And again, a lot of this is, of course, predicated on the fact that maybe they have to have access to devices, and we don't know that every kid out there does. So that's something else we have to consider when we're going into this future-ready world. And then, of course, I'll show you just a couple other examples here of space and time. This was actually here locally. This is Texas A&M. It's kind of about 2 hours from where I live. Texas A&M University. I went to do a guest lecture there once. I walked into this classroom, and I see this. And immediately I think, what does this furniture arrangement say about learning? So drop into the chat and tell me, when you see a classroom like this, when you walk into a classroom like this, 300 desks bolted down to the ground. By the way, if you're left-handed, you're out of luck, apparently. Now that I look in this picture, you're just all right-handed desks. What does this say? Yeah, take a seat, be quiet, Tyler says. That's right. And James hates lecture halls and he's left-handed. Sorry if this is scratching a pain point for you, James. Yeah, I mean, it's telling you, complacency. It's telling you compliance. It's telling you to sit and be quiet. And it tells you that, no one young has back problems. Yes, thank you, Barb. These chairs, there's nothing padded about them. I mean, it's like sitting on nails. There was never a desk in a lecture hall or study room. Yeah, learning is passive. It's not validating. Also, what direction is the learning taking place? I mean, and I think Teresa mentions it's passive. That's true. The person's up at the front, and all the information is being disseminated from their mouth or from their chalkboard all the way to the students that are passively taking the information, right? Yeah, group work would be almost impossible. So what was interesting, when I walked in, I had the kids do a group activity, and I immediately, we couldn't do it. I said, we can't move these things. So I actually took the entire class, and it wasn't full. It was probably maybe 100 kids. And we went out into the hallways of this school building, this College of Education there at A&M, and did a bunch of different interactive activities with them. And I said, and the teacher's like, you can't, where are you taking them? I was like, you can leave the classroom. I always, as a teacher, I don't know if you guys do this, but like the hallways, I would use just about everything, not just my classroom, but I would spread the kids out. I mean, it's great to have those other opportunities. And now that we're going to really be thinking about how we spread kids out in the fall, I mean, I think it's important to think about all those other spaces that go unused a lot of the time. And then Barb says, yeah, that's a great point. I've never caught that. She says, nothing in the room is alive. There are no green plants. There's no windows really, except for the doors, and they go into hallways. He does have technology, if you guys can see it in there. When I asked him if he uses technology with the students, he said, yes, I do. And it's hard to see, but he's actually got 2 different overhead projectors in this picture. And I asked him, why do you have 2 of them? And he said, well, in case one of them breaks, I have a backup. I said, oh, good. That's good. So you can imagine what would probably happen today. Kids walk into this room, they open up their laptops. Are any of them paying attention? Some of them may be, but most of them are probably off doing other things. And it becomes challenging. And those kind of professors are really upset about the world, the way it's changing now with everything becoming digital. I'm going to skip to, I want to make sure I get to the last part of this. So I'm going to skip to this little bit here. But essentially, I talk about Dead Poet Society too, and how, look at all the different places they learned even in that movie. And that movie, by the way, pre-technology. I mean, it took place, the movie was in the 80s, but it took place, I think, in the 20s and 30s. So, but again, lots of different ways and lots of different places where you could learn. And I'll just share this real quick. And that is the idea that, academic improvement can be affected by more than just your pedagogy. Although That is a big part of it. If you look at the green area there, this is flexibility and ownership. This is when you're giving students some ownership of their classroom. And that could be something as simple as, I heard a middle school teacher do this the other day, where she said when the kids came into her room, whether it be virtual or in person, she had one of the students every week pick a song of the day. And so they would have that song as they walked in. Now, appropriate songs, mind you. But that little bit of ownership was crazy. She said she felt a behavioral difference with some of her students, just in that sense that they were like, wow, this teacher listens to me. They care about what I like. They give me a little bit of ownership of just that. And that slight little change can make a difference. Light, temperature, air quality, complexity. There's a lot of things that go to this. And some of these, by the way, those of you on the chat probably can't even control. I mean, we can't really, sometimes some classrooms, you can't even control the temperature. That's controlled like by some sort of master switch. You can't control the color. Although I know where I used to work in Eanes, we started going to where teachers could choose like an accent wall, which was great to give a little bit of breakup from that off-white color. So all of that has effect on academic improvement. So think about that too. We're going to speed through this last part because I want to make sure we have time to get down to the very end, and we were done in about 4 minutes. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick. But when you're looking at the game of school and what that does with curriculum and instruction, this question to me always bothered me. If I was a teacher and I got this question, I felt like in some ways I'd failed as a teacher, because I thought this means that's all they care about is that test. And there's so much more to learning. And you guys know this on the chat. There's so much more to learning than just what's on the test. And so we have to think about, are we able and willing to let kids solve those interesting problems? And then, as somebody mentioned earlier, are we actually going to be okay if they get it wrong and if they fail? And I think that's important. I love that Seth Godin quotes this, and it's true. Not every answer in life is going to be at the back of that textbook. And we have to remember that when we're talking to our kids. How do we give them the space to kind of mess up and fail, while at the same time knowing that we have to get through such a long laundry list of standards and expectations. So we have to make sure we build that time in somehow. And I'll give you an example of an idea of how to do that too. But also, this is actually research from Stanford University about the questioning, in terms of curiosity-based questioning, drops off after the age of about 3 or 4. So if any of you have ever been around a 3 or 4-year-old, you know this. It's like they all ask the same question: why, all the time. I'm like, I don't know. Go ask Alexa. No, not really. But in theory, it shows that when reading and writing increases with students, because they're able to kind of get the knowledge on their own, they don't ask as many curiosity-based questions, which I think is good too. However, I think we also kind of eliminate that. We kind of beat it out of them. In fact, the research, if you dig deeper into it, shows that by 6th grade, the average student asks 0 to 2 curiosity-based questions a day during school. And that's kind of sad. Are we creating a classroom environment that doesn't allow that kind of stuff, where the kids are just like, okay, just tell me what I need to know so I can get to the next thing. We have to be careful of that too. How do we keep this look of curiosity in our students? I mean, this is my daughter looking up at a blimp that was flying over our house when she was about 4 years old. And she's just, that look of wonder. I want her to have that all the way through school. I want her to look at everything that way in school. Except for boys. I don't want her to look at boys that way, but I do want her to I want to have that look of wonder and curiosity, and I want her to keep that. And I want to make sure I'm doing my part as a parent to help her with that, but I want to make sure schools are also doing their part as a parent. Dave Burgess, the Teach Like a Pirate guy, says, don't just teach a lesson, create an experience. I think that's important too. Again, trickier to do nowadays if we're all virtual, but there is still ways to do that, right? And a lot of that comes outside of your comfort zone. You have to be willing to try something a little bit different, and it may not work, admittedly. You may lose control of all the kids. And if you're trying to control 30 kids remotely, Teresa, that could be even trickier, right? I mean, how do you experiment and get them to try something? And it may not work and it may fail. And the next day you say, okay, what did I do differently? What can I learn from it? But you're definitely modeling that. Because again, the answers don't come in the back of these. And we know that, right? This is just a couple quick examples. This is a curriculum that was done in our high school. This is Incubator EDU. And this is not for the straight A students. This is the idea that the struggling C students have a place where they can create and design their own problems of practice. They can create their own companies. Somebody earlier mentioned about the UN's global goals, a great opportunity to do that. They would have a Shark Tank pitch night to talk about how do they solve this problems of practice. And one of the kids that came from this, I mentioned Trashbots earlier. This is actually Rohit. He actually was just graduated at Westlake High School a couple of years ago, and he's now created this company called Trashbots, where he essentially goes out and helps, especially in third world countries, ways to get low-cost robotics into their schools to create things with everyday materials. Again, started with a startup idea and then built it from there and created something different in his life. And so this is the ending part, and this is really about that iterative process. And this is something, by the way, I don't care if you're teaching kindergarten, science, physics, ELA. This is something you can do in any classroom. And it's the idea that you would create a concept, the students create a concept, they design that concept, they build the concept, they test the concept, And then, of course, inevitably, the first few times it should and probably will fail. So they go through the whole redesign process. Eventually, they get to a point where it is ready for launch. This, by the way, is also the scientific method. This, for those of you that are ELA teachers, probably know this better as the writing process, right? When you write and edit and re-edit and before you get to a final copy. So all of this design strategy you can use, and it doesn't matter what your curriculum is. It does take time. It does take you as a teacher being able to say, okay, I'm okay if I fail, or if the kids fail and mess up at this first one, we're going to learn and iterate together. I think you have to model that as well, and I think that's important. And there we go to launch. So as I wrap up, I just want to say a couple things real quick. Thank you guys so much for paying attention today. This is I'm part of a larger organization called futureready.org. If you always want to check out their work, their great work. They're in about 300 districts, I think, across the country now. Free program that does a lot in terms of helping school leaders, especially with this idea of how do we become future ready. We're actually running an event for tech leaders next week for free. So if you have any tech leaders that want to figure out like how are we going to start the school year up, we're gonna ask. And again, it's not one person has the right answer. It's all of us collectively can come up with the best answer. And so I think that's what we're going to do. And next Tuesday, actually, we're having our little Future Ready Tech Leader Summit virtually, of course. And one last thing, I mentioned this lady here, and she is near and dear to my heart. And Aunt Gloria, she passed away about 2 years ago. Right after this picture was taken, she tripped, fell off a curb, broke her wrist, broke her hip, and it was one of those things where we knew that she wasn't going to make it out of the hospital. And I just want to wrap up by telling you that, technology affects everybody in different ways. And when I was visiting her those last few days in the hospital, one of the things she said to me was, she's like, I always wish that I could gone places. I wish I could have gone to places like Machu Picchu. And I looked at her and I said, you know what, we're going to go there right now. And she said, well, I can't get out of this bed. And I said, no, we're going to go there right now. And I looked over at my laptop, over at my iPad, and I brought it out. And I said, you know what, hold this up for a second. And I did. And she started doing this, and she started looking around, and a big giant smile appeared across her face. And she's like, what is this? And I said, you're at Machu Picchu. She's like, what? I was like, yeah, you're here. This is it. And then she said, where else can we go? And I was like, where else do you want to go? So she's like, I want to go to the pyramids. Like, boom, we're at the pyramids, or boom, we're on Mars, and all these different places. And I think about all these tools that are out there and all the things that we're doing as teachers, but we also need to remember that empathetic part. And we talked about at the very beginning of this, when we talked about the idea of robots and automation, is that there is people on the other side of these screens. And when we're teaching this next generation of risk takers, we need to make sure that they add that layer of empathy to it, because sure, everybody can code, but can everybody code with empathy? And I think that's important to know as we go forward. Y'all have been awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to drop out of this right now. That is, are we ready to be future ready? Let me start my share screen here. And we went a few minutes over there. Sorry about that, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. This will be recorded and captured for later. So those of you that did have comments, thank you for dropping those into the chat and being interactive as well. Y'all have been awesome. Thank you for clapping. It's hard to see. I don't see anybody on the other side of the screen. So I love talking to a crowd, but like you guys as teachers probably know this too. It's like you can't get that feeling off of your students, right? So thank you for those of you that are clapping and smiling back there. I appreciate it. Thank you for the chat.
It was great. It was great, Carl. Thank you so much for sharing that story about your aunt. That was a beautiful story.
I can't tell that story. My wife isn't here at the moment. I honestly cannot tell that story if she's in the room, because I look at her and I'll just start crying. So I don't do that. But let me stop the recording here. All right.